So, welcome everyone to a new webinar colloquium Navarra Confidencial, well, España Confidencial as well. I am your host. My name is Hugo Stornodiolo Silva, and I am the international correspondent for España Confidencial. Today, we're going to be joined by Professor Walter Block from Loyola University and by Professor Allen Mendenhall, who's an associate dean at Troy University, and we're gonna talk about environmentalism, socialism, and as well as business regulations in that same line of thought. So welcome. We have today a pair of fine academics and gentlemen joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be here.
All right, so we usually start our interviews with each of our guests introducing themselves to our audience. So if we can begin with Professor Block and then with Professor Mendenhall, that would be great.
Okay, my name is Walter Block. I'm a professor at economics at Loyola University in New Orleans, and I got my PhD from Columbia University. And my main claim to fame is that I once shook the hand of Ludwig von Mises, and very few people nowadays are old enough to have even overlapped with him. And I never washed my hands since, so my hand is very dirty. But if you shake my hand, you channel Mises. So that's my main claim to fame.
Thank you, Professor Block. All right, Professor Mendenhall.
Thanks, Walter. That was great. I just washed my hands about 5 minutes before this interview, so we come from different places. I'm an associate dean and Grady Rogier professor at the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University in Troy, Alabama, and I think Walter and I have a lot of colleagues in common and friends in common. And I am an associated scholar with the Heartland Institute. Associated faculty member with the Mises Institute. Been a visiting scholar recently with the American Institute for Economic Research, and I'm excited to be joining Walter here today on a very interesting topic.
Yeah, Professor Mendenhall is also a huge enthusiast for bow ties, so that's that's another thing to consider. All right, thank you, professors. So, well, the main topic we wanted to address with my colleague in this interview was about about environmentalism. We thought of Professor Block, and because he has written about the subject, we thought of Professor Mendenhall because he's an associate scholar at the Harland Institute, which promotes some kind of climate change realism, so to speak. But I think that we can change a little bit the way we are guiding this interview, because not every kind of environmentalism, not every kind of regulation is guided towards saving nature or saving the environment. So my first question for the two of you would be, why does the state want to regulate environmental aspects, and why do business are among the first to be affected by those regulations? I would like to begin with Professor Block and then go to Professor Mendenhall.
Could you repeat the question? I'm not sure I got the last nuance.
So the question was, why the state wants to regulate on environmental aspects, how are businesses the first to be affected by those regulations?
Why does the government want to regulate business in order to protect the environment?
Yeah.
You know, I'm a anarcho-capitalist. I'm a free market anarchist. So I don't believe that any government is justified, and certainly no government regulation. But if I put on my hat as a minarchist, as a moderate libertarian, where there is a legitimate role for government, and it's mainly to protect personal freedom. Would regulations be justified? Well, Yes, there would be regulations, namely to protect private property rights. And a lot of left-wing economists, they see pollution as a market failure, as an external diseconomy, as a negative externality. And they say, well, we need regulations. Well, the way Murray Rothbard would look at this, and he is my main mentor, my guru in these sort of things, he would say, well, you don't really need regulations, but pollution is not really an externality. It's rather just a trespass. It's a trespass of smoke particles or smells, as in the case of a pig farm, or noise, as in the case of an airport. And how do we determine who has a right when there seems to be a conflict? Let's suppose that I live near the airport and the airport is very noisy. And are they polluting me? And do I have a right to shut down the airport or not? And what Murray would say, if I understand him correctly, is, well, it depends upon who owns the rights. And how do you determine who owns the rights? Well, who was there first? And if the airport was there first making noise and I come to the nuisance, so to speak, well, I have no standing in law. Or I shouldn't have any standing in law, and the airport should be able to commit noise. There is this issue of nowadays, racism is a very important issue for a lot of people, and there is a concept called environmental racism. So what's that? Well, suppose I have a polluting factory, and what will happen? And I was there first, and the factory is say 1/4 mile square, and the pollution goes for 10 miles square. And I was there first. I was there before anyone else was there. Maybe it's Pittsburgh or something like that. And I make steel and I pollute. I mean, if you need an oxygen tent, you probably shouldn't live in Pittsburgh or places like that. They were there first. And what happens to the land values all around my factory? Well, the land values, other things equal, are less. And now suppose some black people or poor people move there in order to take advantage of the lower land values. Well, then that's not environmental racism. On the other hand, if they were there first and then I set up my polluting factory, and then that's environmental racism, and that they're very poor and maybe unable to fight me in court or something like that. So the libertarian would oppose that. So the key to understanding this libertarian way of looking at it, and by the way, we are free market environmentalists. We're not against the environment. It's just that we have a different way of promoting the environment, not through socialism, but through capitalism. And what capitalism means is private property rights. So if you come to the nuisance, you should have no standing in law. But if you're the aggrieved party, if you were there first, and then I come along with my factory and I pollute you, well, then I'm guilty of trespassing. Take the following case. Suppose I take my garbage, my eggshells and orange peels and pork rinds and everything else, and I dump it on your front lawn. Well, we all know what that is. That's trespassing. And if you're a nice neighbor, you might say to me, "Hey, have you lost your mind? What are you doing?" And if I keep doing it, you're going to say you're going to call the cops and you're going to put me in jail for doing that. But if I take all of my garbage, my eggshells and my orange peels and everything else, and I grind it up into very small smoke particles, and now I put them on your front lawn or in your lungs, well, it's the same thing. So that would be, I think, the way the anarcho-capitalist or the free market environmentalist would deal with the pollution issue.
Right. Thank you, Professor Block. Now we're going to Professor Mendenhall. So I would like for you to explain a little bit more of the part about how businesses are affected by these kind of regulations. Because Professor Block already told us that it is some kind of, well, there shouldn't be any kind of regulations that come from the state, but anyway, they exist and they affect people and they affect businesses.
Well, sure. Yeah, I guess the first thing I'll say, just by way of introduction to myself, is that I like nature. Like Walter said, you can enjoy the environment and be a free market capitalist. And I like the aesthetics of nature. And as someone who considers himself a Christian, I believe I'm called to stewardship of God's creation. And so there's nothing wrong with protecting the environment or being concerned about environmental issues. I believe, philosophically, that there are problems with granting equal moral worth or status to nature and humans. That's a different story. And also with bad politics and economics in the pursuit of environmental preservation and conservation. But green politics in particular, to me, is troublesome because it incorporates elements of social justice ideologies and suggests that the eradication of poverty is essential to environmental sustainability, or that am I still there? Sorry, somebody is calling in on my phone. Sorry, someone was calling right as I was talking. So-called rights to healthcare or gender equity have some kind of practical bearing on nature. Those are all problematic. But as to just concrete, regulations or what have you that have a bearing on business, I mean, there's so many, it's hard to even begin a list. I mean, we have the Environmental Protection Agency here, which is an executive agency. And our executive agencies, you hear a lot of complaints these days about the growth of the administrative state, and part of it is because of these administrative agencies we have, which are functionally under the executive branch, although they're creatures of legislation. But within them, they house their own court system. They have their own, executives. They promulgate rules and regulations. So they're almost little governments unto themselves that float outside the traditional tripart separation of powers paradigm, and they're very problematic. But you have EPA regs on air, water, pesticides, hazardous waste, motor vehicles, air conditioning, pollution, metals, asbestos, lead, cargo, warehousing. I mean, there's so many of them. I couldn't even begin to give you an exhaustive list. But then, on the sort of the international stage, you also have things called eco tariffs, which are erected purportedly to reduce. They're erected to tax imports or exports that involve products with high carbon emissions, or maybe to tax goods from countries that purportedly have bad environmental policies. But the interesting thing is that the richer people can become through trade, the more luxury they have to actually care about environmental factors and actually institute sustainable practices. So these are fundamentally bad ideas. I mean, there are all kinds of things that you could talk about with eco taxes, and there are people that advocate for free public transport, saying that these are supposed to reduce the use of personal vehicles to preserve gasoline and all these kinds of things, and there are carbon credits. There are a lot of different ways that environmental regulations impact everyday business.
Thank you, Professor Mendenhall. You were very descriptive of the way these regulations are being introduced to the economy and to the market system, and to everyday life. Well, I was thinking about before the Biden administration that began this year, there were two very important events in which we saw this kind of relationship between environmentalism and socialism. The first one was the promotion of the Green New Deal by certain democratic lawmakers, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and many of her squad partners, and as well as when President Trump decided to make the United States to drop of the Paris Agreement. So my question is, how do you think these two pieces of, the first one was a piece of legislation, and the other one was an international agreement. What do you think the main importance and the content of these pieces of law were for the environmental and the business aspect of the United States and of the world. Again, I would like to begin with Walter and then go with Professor Allen.
Okay. Well, the Green New Deal is just an attempt to promote socialism as the Roosevelt New Deal, and I think free market environmentalists would oppose the Green New Deal. What they're trying to do is have wind and water power and solar power and things like that, and to stop coal and to stop oil, and also nuclear power. They're very much against nuclear power. Whereas the way I see it, we should have a fair race between all of the fuels that create energy. And we shouldn't put our thumb on the balance scale and say, well, we should support water and solar and other kinds of energy and oppose coal and oil and nuclear. We should just let the market decide. It's sort of like which is more important, peas or carrots? Well, let the market decide. We shouldn't promote peas and stop carrots, or vice versa. We should just let the market decide. And if coal and oil are really trespassing, well, then they have to pay for it, and the cost of it will be higher. So we internalize the externality would be the way that the economists would look at it. And what they're doing is using this as a vehicle to stop economic development. And as Alan said, if I could put words in his mouth, in the what do you call it, the health field, we say wealthier is healthier. The richer you are, the healthier you are. And also, to put words in Alan's mouth, wealthier is more environmentally protective. So if you're richer, we can have a better environment than if we're poor. If we're poor, we don't really care about the environment that much. We care about where the next meal is coming from. So anything that impoverishes us, paradoxically, is going to worsen the environment. And what the Green New Deal is doing is impoverishing us, because it's making, it's very costly to get energy, and it's very unreliable to get energy, as the situation in Texas recently showed. That if you're relying on solar, solar only goes during the day and when the sun is out. And wind power is also unreliable. And by the way, those wind things kill birds, so you have other difficulties in that way. So I'm not really a big fan of the Green New Deal. I wanted to mention one other environmental issue that you haven't raised, and I don't think it's too irrelevant, and that is saving species. There is elephants and rhinoceroses are in great danger of being extinct because, well, the left-wingers would say it's because of human greed and capitalism and profit-seeking. What I think Alan and I would say, if I could push Alan into my camp, I'm sure he'll go not reluctantly, and that is because they're not owned. If we privatize the elephants and we privatize the rhinoceroses, we would have no problems with endangerment. The example I often use for my classes is the cow and the buffalo. They're roughly the same animal. Biologists would take affront at what I just said, but they look to me about the same. And yet one never came within 1 million miles of extinction, and the other, the buffalo, almost went extinct. Well, what's the difference? One was privately owned always, and the buffalo was not. So you had this thing called the tragedy of the commons. And with regard to the Paris Accord, the main polluters are not the United States. The main polluters are India and China and places like that. And they're not even promising to do much of anything until, 2030 or 2050 or something like that. So it seems, I think Donald Trump was right on this issue, that it seems inefficient, ineffective, whatever, to worry that the U.S., which creates very, very little of the world's pollution, should really, stop all industry, whereas China and India and many other countries are are polluting much more. It's interesting with regard to Brazil. People are saying, well, you Brazilians should stop, and the Brazilians are saying, well, you guys are already economically developed. We're not. We'd like to have some economic development too. So if you want us to stop, pay us something, and that doesn't seem to be flying.
All right, thank you, Professor Block.
Yeah, what I would say about the Green New Deal is, first of all, to contextualize it, when there are libertarian goals and they become matters of public policy, they become sort of imperfect enunciations of some more pure philosophical thing. And I think the Green New Deal is the same thing. So whereas it for the left, whereas it may articulate certain public policy positions or practical solutions to problems, it really is an expression of a more sort of fundamental ideology. So it's sort of the I don't know. I guess it's what I mean. It's just the nature of what public policy is. The perfect options being unavailable. People look for sort of pragmatic articulations for practical solutions. So that said, the Green New Deal is sort of a representation of this whole notion of climate justice or eco-socialism, or whatever terms. I know there are a lot of different schools and camps when it comes to environmentalism, but climate justice, the idea is to give moral import to the politics involving environmental issues, and it involves claims about equality, disparate impacts of pollution and climate change on poor and marginalized communities. And from that comes demands to redistribute wealth, or to ensure that certain populations have access to government funds, whether it's in the form of emergency relief or some sort of welfare. But it's always problematic when government is picking and choosing beneficiaries or winners and losers rather than leaving things to the market. I know the flyer you created for this show was something like, wait, what was it? Is environmentalism necessarily socialism, or does it invariably lead to socialism, or something like that? But I mean, the short answer is that it depends. And in my opinion, it depends. It depends on which environmentalism you're talking about, because there's so many different kinds. But to the extent that there are some out there that say the community as a whole owns the means of production, then then there is socialism, and that would be what basically eco-socialism is. And that the eco-socialists, they want to dismantle capitalism in sort of the old school spirit of Marxism, and want to establish a commons in which a state owns the means of production and governs all use of the resources in the commons. And they believe that capitalism causes inequality between humans that somehow impacts the environment, I guess, through the destruction of habitats or pollution. Maybe pollution disproportionately impacts certain populations or something like that. They're worried about depleting scarce resources and clearing forests and trees and dumping waste, and saying people don't dump waste in rich people's neighborhoods, they only do it in poor people's neighborhoods, and things like this. So there are definitely implications that are socialist to all of this type of these eco movements. And as Walter pointed out, Green New Deal is named what it's named because it's deliberately meant to harken back to the New Deal from earlier in the 20th century, and the New Deal was socialist. I mean, so these are all interesting things to discuss. I'm not sure I could sit here and talk to you in detail about the ins and outs of the Green New Deal, but the sort of ideologies and philosophies underlying it are highly problematic and socialist at heart. So
I wanted to follow up on what Alan said. The way I see the environmental movement is there are certain people that just like to run other people's lives. They just like to boss other people around. Who knows why? Maybe it's environmental, heredity, who knows? And socialism was working out pretty well for them for a long time, starting in, I don't know, 1885 and certainly 1917 and Marx. But then the whole thing became unglued. You had almost a laboratory experiment of the difference between East Germany and West Germany, North Korea and South Korea, the same culture, the same history, the same language, the same everything. And then due to an accident of war, East Germany and West Germany and North and South Korea went in different paths. And then we could see the results. And they needed another vehicle. In other words, socialism was the horse and the wagon was, bossing other people around. So they had to get a new horse. And the next horse was environmentalism. Environmentalism is taking the place of socialism. And I shouldn't say environmentalism, I should say left-wing environmentalism, because free market environmentalism is very, very different. That's something Alan and I support. Left-wing environmentalists, socialist environmentalists, is their new horse that's going to pull their wagon of bossing other people around. And by the way, they now have a new horse, and that is not economic Marxism, but cultural Marxism. Instead of the bourgeoisie ruining the proletariat, it's white toxic males who are ruining everything. I mean, they keep coming up with new horses to pull their wagon, and their desire is to run the lives of other people. And who knows what the next thing will be, but I guarantee you that after the left-wing environmentalism passes and after this cultural Marxism passes, they'll come up with something else. Who knows what it'll be? Maybe it'll be chess is no good, or I don't know, ping pong is no good. I can't imagine what the next thing will be, but there'll be something again, where they need a vehicle to pull us in the direction of them bossing other people around. They just don't want to have any live and let live. They don't want to allow people to, live their lives. They want to control them. It's sort of a totalitarian impetus in the human spirit or something like that. So that's the way I see a left-wing environmentalism. It's not so much to save the planet or to save species. If they were really worried about saving species, they'd privatize. If they were really worrying about the the environment, they would adhere to the libertarian view of private property rights. They're not really interested in that. What they're interested in is running the lives of other people, and they're just using environmentalism now as an excuse in order to move them in that direction.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Professor Mendenhall, as well. You both talked about the tragedy of the commons and about its implications both in economics and in law. So I would like to hear how you can explain the tragedy of the commons, and as well how that can be related to environmentalism. I would like to begin with Professor Mendenhall.
Okay, well, I guess the notion of the tragedy of the commons is that if you have a space that is unowned, it's a piece of property that is held in common, that it will invariably be destroyed ultimately, because there are scarce resources and everyone will just use them all up, and they'll disappear. So that's kind of the notion of the tragedy of the commons. There are people whose work, I'm not as familiar with as I should be. I know Elinor Ostrom did a lot of work in the commons and suggested that there are actually, when people have these properties in commons, maybe they don't destroy it in the way people think or whatever. I'm not so familiar with all those arguments and how they play out. But I think the fundamental problem with all this is that, I think if you're going to be free market environmentalist, you're looking at markets and property rights, and you're saying that those work to reduce pollution and protect the environment. I mean, obviously, if I own property and it's not some type of property that I've held in common, then I'm going to protect my own property and the best, use it to its best possible way. And the left tends to want to see this commons issue and suggest that, as I mentioned, the eco-socialist in this context, where they want a sort of a government ownership over the commons so that they can control what happens and institute rules, regulations, or whatever. and control the resources on that commons. But government is one of the most one of the greatest polluters there is. It may be the greatest polluter. There's no evidence that the government pollutes less than private businesses or anything like that. And I think that the free market environmentalists are they're more likely to figure out ways to solve these environmental crises by unfettered entrepreneurship and innovation and the possibilities of technology. And those are the types of things that you encourage and you let those things flourish. So if the environment is a concern to people, if it's a serious cultural issue, if it's something consumers care about, then businesses will find ways to make those priorities. And this is getting somewhat far afield from sort of the philosophical question of the commons, but my overarching point is that leaving all that idea of the commons aside, and it's just private industry and markets are going to yield much better solutions than you can get so bogged down in this. I mean, there's a vast literature about the commons and the environmental work and negative externalities and alleged market failures, and then all those things are like what the entire environmentalist philosophical program is predicated on. But so to some extent, I see why we would want to sit here and nitpick and talk about those things. But I'd almost love to explore how private businesses would generate better environmental responses than those programs and policies that the left champions.
Shall I comment on the tragedy of the commons now?
Please do, Walter.
Please go on.
Suppose I owned 100 acres of grassland and I had a bunch of cows. What I would do is I would maybe let the cows eat the grass, but not all the way down to the roots. Because if they ate them down to the roots, then there'd be no more grass. What I would do is maybe divide it into, 3 parts and let them eat on the part 1. And then as soon as it gets down to the roots, I take them off that pasture and I put them on another pasture and then let the first pasture regenerate or rejuvenate or whatever. But suppose the 3 of us all had herds of cows and we all owned the land in common and we weren't nice guys and we were just trying to make profits. What we would do is I would say, well, if I don't allow my cows to eat the grass down to the roots, Alan's cows are going to get them. So the hell with Alan's cows. I'm going to let my cows go to the roots. So this would be one example of the tragedy of the commons. Another example of the tragedy of the commons is fishing. Why should I leave any fish for you guys? I'm selfish. I'm a capitalist pig. I have dollar signs on my eyeballs and a cash register for a heart. And the hell with you guys. I'm going to get the last fish, even though there'll be no more fish. So that's why they have to have fishing seasons. I mean, we don't have cow seasons or chicken seasons. I mean, you can slaughter a cow or a chicken whenever you want because you own it. And you're going to, if you slaughter all your cows, you're not going to have any cows tomorrow. So we have economic irrationality when we have the tragedy of the commons. Another example would be, suppose I give out to my class, each one has a can of Coca-Cola. And I rate the rate at which I measure the rate at which they sip, and they'll sip very slowly because they know they'll have it. But if I put it all in a communal thing and I give them all a straw and forget about the sanitary issues, what they're going to do is slurp it up much quicker, because then they're each going to say, well, if I don't slurp it up more quickly, Ugo and Alan are going to get my share, so I'd better slurp it up faster. So what you have with the tragedy of the commons is overuse and a too quick use of the product. Now, I'm glad that Alan mentioned Elinor Ostrom. who I regard as pure evil on this issue, and this is what she mainly specializes in. What she says is no such thing as a tragedy of the commons, and it's a fallacy. Well, I have several articles on this, really, where I try to, criticize her very heavily. And the example she'll give is some, what do you call it, pasture in the middle of Switzerland somewhere. And she says, well, it's really, that worked out fine. But that's not a commons. Look, if I brought my cows to that Swiss place, they would all say, what are you, crazy? You can't bring your cows. This is our pasture. It was a partnership. So one of my articles, I forget the titles of these articles. One of them is The Tragedy of the Partnership. Look, a lot of law firms have partners, be 500 partners, and each of them has access to the law library. But if I go there, they're going to say, well, what are you doing here? You're not part of the partnership. So Ostrom doesn't understand the difference between a partnership and a commons. A commons means anyone can come in there. Now, I have 3 books on privatization, one privatizing roads, one privatizing space, and the other privatizing oceans, rivers, and lakes. And the problem with oceans, rivers, and lakes is no one owns them, and we have the tragedy of the commons, and that's why we have overfishing.
Yeah.
There was this bet between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich. Julian Simon was on our side, Paul Ehrlich was on the other side. They were betting, we're running out of resources, which is another concern of left-wing environmentalists. And they agreed that if the prices rise, well, then we're running out of resources. If the price of these relative prices fall, then we're not. And Julian Simon won the bet. And then Paul Ehrlich says, well, let's have another bet. Let's have a bet on fish. And I say we're going to be running out of fish. And what Julian Simon said is, yeah, sure, I'll bet you on fish, but we got to include farm fish. And then Paul Ehrlich learned this lesson, and he said, well, forget about the bet. The point is, we're never going to run out of farm fish, but we might well run out of ocean fish because ocean fish are owned in common. So you have the tragedy of the commons. And then you have this thing, the UN law, the Sea Treaty, where everybody owns 1/n of all the oceans, and nobody can privatize the oceans. Well, look, in the Soviet Union, they had collectivized farming on about 97% of the arable land, and they produced 75% of the crops. And on the 3% of the land that was privately owned in the form of front yards and backyards of the farm workers, they produced 25% of the crops. Well, you got something like that imbalance, only even worse with the oceans. The oceans are 3/4 of the Earth's surface, and they produce maybe 1% of world GDP. And the land is 25% of the surface, and it produces 99% of the GDP. One reason, obviously, there are more people on the land than on the oceans, but another reason is because we have the tragedy of the commons. We have this craziness. We are only allowed to fish for a certain season, and then they come up with really super duper boats and better nets, and then they say, well, we have to cut the fishing season even smaller. This is no way to run a railroad. This is crazy. The idea that we all own the ocean is the tragedy of the commons. What we should do is start privatizing. Now, Robert Nozick, bless him, he was a great guy in many ways, but he said if you pour a can of tomato juice into the ocean, you're just wasting your tomato juice. Well, this is an attack on John Locke. John Locke said we should, privatize stuff, and he only meant it for the land. But why not apply it for the oceans, the rivers, and the lakes? Yes, my motto is: if it moves, privatize it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. Since everything either moves or doesn't move, privatize everything. And if we privatized everything, we would have no more tragedy of the commons. So I think that, private property rights are very integral in supporting a rational environmental situation.
Thank you, Professor Block. Well, Professor Mendenhall mentioned that there are several free market alternatives and entrepreneurial alternatives to environmental, and so I would like to hear some of your ideas about them. I would like to begin again with Professor Mendenhall.
Well, that's the thing, is the one beautiful thing about markets is that I don't have to have all the solutions. I don't know them. That's up for the people that are innovators to go figure it out. I can't even if I couldn't possibly scheme up something like that. So I truly can't give you answers that the market would yield. The market's made up of innumerable minds, working in ways that each one individually doesn't even understand. And so I can't just sit here and give you a panacea or some kind of utopian solution. But what I can say that it goes more back to sort of the enforcement mechanism of let's say private wrongs that are involving nuisance or something like this. And this gets back to what Walter was talking about at the very beginning when he was talking about Rothbard, is that certain problems, environmental problems, they result in conflict or result in actual personal wrongs. Like, let's say I'm running something that has I don't even know, some sort of form of waste in my property, and I spill it all over Walter's, and it affects Walter's health, it destroys his property, whatever. Well, under just good old-fashioned tort laws that arose through centuries in the common law system, there are remedies available, absent the EPA, absent all these federal regulations. It's not as everyone always seems to think, well, there's a problem, we got to have the government to solve it. We need a statute for that. We need regulation for that. It's like, well, in the absence of all these things, do you think that like nothing is going to happen? Like there are historic remedies for things like this. And first of all, they're just basic contracts. So you can contract with people about if I'm doing something next door that Walter doesn't like, well, we can maybe bargain and exchange about how that activity ought to take place, and maybe there's something he could do to get a cut of money. I don't know, but we could work that out through contract. But under common law historically, tort law involved private civil suits by claimants against alleged tortfeasors, and it's a fault-based means for compensating harmed parties. The whole goal of tort law is to make a wronged party whole, to restore the person in the position he would have been in had the thing never occurred. And I in law school, my tort law class was, it was mostly about the tort of negligence. We spent probably 75% of the class dealing with negligence because it's so fundamental to torts. But the whole idea behind negligence is that you got to have a duty, a breach, causation, and damages. So if I can't owe a duty to somebody that was unforeseeably harmed by my activity, if I do something and eventually down the chain of causation somewhere, someone so unforeseeable to be affected by my activity is harmed, well, I can't be directly liable for that. And but I have to have breached it. I should have done something wrong. The thing I did wrong has to actually have caused the harm to the person who suffered the wrong, and that person has to have actual damages. They can't say I might potentially get hurt, so therefore you pay me. It's like I remember this one lawyer told me about his client, and he drove through McDonald's and bit into a hamburger and did not bite into the screw, but noticed that there was a screw in the hamburger, pulled it out, and called his lawyer, said, guess what? Because they read all these stories in the media. Guess what? I found a screw in my hamburger. Like, how much do you think I'm going to get out of this? And he said, well, did you swallow it? Did you get hurt? And he said, no. I just pulled it right out. You didn't bite it? Didn't hurt your tooth? No. Well, you're probably entitled to a free hamburger if you go back to the line and tell them what you found, but you're not going to get any damages out of a court because you didn't actually suffer a wrong. At any rate, this is a long way of saying that we have mechanisms in place that are sort of emergent, that have evolved over time, that do address these remedies without having to do, massive federal regulations, and they involve redress for things as basic as nuisance to occupational exposure to things that happen on the job, to things that happen to your home, to waste, to sewage, even obnoxious odors. there are historic remedies at common law for those kinds of things that developed through juries, through local parties, as local as they come, and did not require any sort of coercive top-down implementation. And I think Rothbard was a fan of common law, and I think common law yields all kinds of interesting resolutions that nobody actually thought up. To get back to the kind of the theme that I began when I started answering your question is, no one had to sit here and come up with this gigantic scheme of remedies for what happens for all these different environmental issues. They emerged out of the everyday interactions of people trying to solve their problems and involving other people to help them solve the problems when they couldn't do it by themselves. And we have a lot of historic precedent for how to solve some of these problems. And so just creating new ways to solve the problems that are more complicated, more expensive, doesn't really do anything but line the pockets of attorneys and and all the government bureaucrats and leaders and politicians. So,
well, since you mentioned the civil law and common law and contracts, I remember that in civil law there's this institution called servidumbre, in which I'm using the Spanish term, in which, for example, if you have access to a certain resource, such as water, a river, or something, and your neighbor does not have access to that resource, you can do a contract with him or with her in order to allow him to have access to that resource, and he has to pay you something, or he has to give you something in exchange. So not only in common law there are the alternatives, but in civil law tradition as well. All right,
sure.
Now to you, Walter.
Well, I wanted to say that I'm delighted to have Alan as sort of my partner, because we sort of feed off of each other and we're both on the same wavelength. And all I can say is I applaud what he said, and I'd like to just add my own examples to it. He was quite right in saying, I don't know what the word is, innocence or inability to be a central planner. Namely, he said he doesn't know exactly what the entrepreneurs are going to do. The example that comes to my mind is, suppose the government has always made shoes. So we had shoe socialism. And then some maniac like me or Alan said, well, we should really privatize the shoe industry. Then the questions have come thick and fast. Well, how many shoe stores would there be on each block? How would we decide whether to have brown shoes or blue shoes or green shoes? Would we have laces in the shoes? And how about high-heeled shoes? And what about sneakers? And the answer is, we don't know. We can't tell exactly how the market would be. I mean, Monday morning quarterbacking is interesting. Now we know what the shoe industry looks like. There's some shoes in malls and this and that and the other. But before the shoes were privatized, we couldn't predict, because we're not entrepreneurs. We're theoreticians of economics. I mean, we might also be entrepreneurs in a different context, but as professors, we're not entrepreneurs. We're theoreticians of economics. I mentioned that I have 3 books on privatization. One of them was roads. And the reason I wrote this book is 40,000 people die on the nation's roads in the United States. And I said, we should privatize the roads. And then we'll have competition, and we'll have a reduction in deaths. And one of the examples I used was, right now in the United States, the minimum speed on the major highways is 40 and the maximum speed is 70. And I said, well, maybe it would be better if each lane had a different speed limit. Maybe on the right lane, we should be 55, in the middle lane, 70, and the left lane, 85. Or maybe it should be 60, 70, and 80. I don't know. I'm not a road entrepreneur. All I'm saying is that if on Alan's road it was 60, 70, and 80, and on Ugo's road it was 55, 70, and 85, we would then see which is better. Just like we see which is the best way to make a bow tie. Alan's got a very nice bow tie. He doesn't know how to make a bow tie. We have specialization and division of labor. And the people that make the best bow ties are the ones who win out. Well, it would be the same with roads. But people, it's hard for them to see that. Hayek said something interesting to piggyback on what Alan said. He said that our culture is based on, I forget the exact quote, something like on the basis of human action but not human design. In other words, nobody designed this. It was just human action through tort law and natural law and things that Alan was talking about, that these things came about. but you don't have central planning. You see the idea that so many people have. I get freshman students in my class, and I talk about, I don't know, minimum wage or price gouging, and they're just appalled. I think there's some sort of, I don't know what it is, hard wiring for socialism that people have. And I try to tell them, well, price gouging really isn't so bad, and, try to explain this, and then minimum wage isn't going to, create everything. But they have this this attitude that if it's not centrally planned, it's irrational. And this is what Hayek fought against. Hayek used to say every generation is consigned to fight the same old battles. Well, I think it's because of biology. And what Hayek was saying was that competition will bring about a better product, even though we don't know exactly how the steel industry will have competition. Because I don't know about the steel industry, and Alan doesn't know about the chicken industry. He might know about that, but perhaps he doesn't. I don't know much about that. But the chicken industry and the steel industry, they compete with each other, and we have this idea that if you have private property rights and competition, you'll get a better product, even though we don't know exactly how it's going to work, because that's an entrepreneurial kind of a thing.
Yeah, I do agree. And well, since we have like 10 minutes, because we don't like for interviews to go any longer than an hour and a half, I was going to ask you the following. Since both environmentalism and economics themselves are about resources, and since resources are always scarce and economics is also about the scarcity, what do you think can happen if we ever, by any chance, get to a post-scarcity economy? Now, I would like
get to what kind of economy?
A post-scarcity economy, one in which there's no more scarcity, in which there is no more
scarcity.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay. I like to get what the question is before I answer. Go ahead, Alan.
Well, I'm just having a hard time conceiving of a post-scarcity economy. I mean, I don't see there. I don't know that there's truly any such thing as a lack of scarcity. I mean, I guess I don't understand what that means. To be perfectly frank with you.
Well, it's about resources are so abundant that everyone has access to any resource. There is no scarcity. There is no competition for resources.
Yeah, that seems to me like a fantasy.
Well, I hate to agree with Alan. I hate to be a yes man, but I'm going to have to agree with Alan. The whole idea of economics is to deal with scarcity. And if there were look, I mean, even in the Garden of Eden, there's scarcity because there's alternative costs of time. You can only do one thing at a time. So even in the garden, the Garden of Eden is going to come as close to post-scarcity as we can get, right?
I mean, even time. I mean, time is scarce. I mean, and that's all we know.
Right. So I'm saying even in the Garden of Eden. In other words, if we're going to get closer to the to post-scarcity, it's going to be in the Garden of Eden. But even in the Garden of Eden, in other words, I'm trying to not have a straw man and say, well, we want to cure cancer, we want to go to the moon, we want to do this. That's too easy. But even in the Garden of Eden, there's going to be scarcity because you can only do one thing at a time. And, some people say, well, all in my era, everyone wanted to go to bed with Marilyn Monroe. Well, suppose there were a million Marilyn Monroes, but we all want to go to bed with the real one, not with a fake one. So there's always going to be scarcity. And if there's no scarcity, which I regard as roughly like a square circle, namely a contradiction, well, then there's no economics. And we have to quit economics because economics is the study of what occurs when we have scarcity. So if there's no scarcity, well, there's no economics. I'll have to give up my day job. I'll no longer be an economist. Even then, we could talk about what would the world be like if there were scarcity, so there'd still be room for economics. So I'm not giving up my job yet. But I regard this as roughly like a square circle. or 2 plus 2 is 5, or some sort of crazy thing like that, because human desires are infinite. I mean, we are a bunch of pigs. Oink, oink, oink. We want more of everything. And I want to live forever. I want to be able to go faster than the speed of not sound, the speed of light, which I understand is impossible from a physical point of view, although I'm a little weak on physics. But I think that post scarcity is nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, even if you're trying to argue that, like, I'll use an example of air. Well, there's a superabundance of air. We don't pay for air. Is that true? I thought that's what all this climate, all this climate emissions rules and all that's about. Is there some air better than others? And, you certainly have a scarcity of air if you're gone to outer space and you try to breathe out there. But, they're different kinds of air. You'd rather breathe one air than another kind of air. I'd rather live in maybe probably in a place that's got, pristine conditions, and I'm not, getting whatever in my lungs, So even the air example falls under that superabundance kind of argument.
I've allotted an hour for this, and we got 5 more minutes. So maybe one more question for the two of us ought to cover it.
All right, let me think of a question, because I am running out of ideas, because we talked about the tragedy of the commons, about post scarcity. Maybe about a general question about no, you already talked about that, about why socialists are so attracted to environmentalism. But the other way around, why are environmentalists so attracted to socialism? Because it's more usual to see environmentalists that are socialists than environmentalists that are free marketers or conservatives, or I don't know.
Yeah, that's tough for me to answer, because I can't really impute motives to other people and understand what it is that drives them to make certain choices. But I would say there's so much overlap in a lot of these environmental schools with just different schools of leftist politics. I mean, you could go to, I can understand why someone might be a feminist, but then you go and you find out that there's a school called ecofeminism, which seeks an egalitarian collectivist utopia in which the environment enjoys the benefits of having no dominant group of humans or something like that. I just think a lot of it is people they go down rabbit holes, and they start getting attracted to left-wing politics, and they probably just toy around with what that means, and they start reading one thing and it leads them to another, and maybe that's how it happens. But I can't speak on behalf of other people and why they got to where they got. It might be an interesting a question for somebody who, say, is an ecofeminist or something. And how did you get there? What drove you to that way of thinking? I wouldn't know myself.
I'd like to spend the last few minutes talking about another environmental issue that you haven't raised, called global warming. Because if we're going to fry, well, then maybe we should stop using refrigerators or air conditioners or whatever. The way I look at this, in the 1970s, you know what these people were saying? They were saying it's global cooling. And whose fault is global cooling? Capitalism. And what's the solution? Government intervention. In other words, they always have the verdict clear. It's capitalism's fault, and the indictment keeps changing. So in the 70s, it was global cooling. In the 90s, it was global warming. And then we came up with a bunch of freezing weather, and all of a sudden we changed again. And by the way, whose fault was global warming? Capitalism's fault, and that's the verdict is socialism. And nowadays it's neither global warming nor global cooling. It's temperature change. Well, the temperature is always changing, and if it's global warming or global cooling or global changing, it's always capitalism's fault. This is too rough. Now look, if you want to change things, and let's suppose it's global warming. If you want to change things, the burden of proof is, as Alan was talking about in tort law. If I am accusing him of doing me dirty in some way, the burden of proof is on me to prove it. He doesn't have to prove anything. The assumption is that he's innocent. You're innocent until proven guilty. So how have these people acquitted their burden of proof? Well, you know what they do? They start saying that anyone who disagrees with them is a denier. And where do you get denier? We know where we get denial from, Holocaust denial. And, and what they try to do is they try to put people in jail, put them in jail for disagreeing with them. Look, in astronomy, they're having a debate. Is Pluto a planet or not? I don't know. Whatever they decide, I'll go along with. By the way, the Earth looks pretty flat to me. I hate to tell you, it looks pretty, but they decided it's round, and I don't know from that. I'm a poor economist. I go along with them. So if they're having a fair debate, I'll go along with the experts. I believe in specialization and division of labor, and I don't know everything about everything. But in this global warming debate, they're not debating fairly. They're trying to get people to lose their jobs for disagreeing with them, and even put them in jail. Well, look, suppose the people who said that Pluto is a planet were trying to put the other guys in jail. I would then tend to agree with the other guys. I would say, well, if they have to hit below the belt in that way, maybe they're wrong. So I'm very suspicious of this. But if and when they acquit their burden of proof, well, then I'll go along and say, well, then it's like trespass. If you use oil or gas, well, then you're heating up the planet and we'll all fry. Well, then you got to stop it. So I'm not against this. It's just that they have to meet their burden of proof, and not only haven't they met their burden of proof, they don't even think that there is a burden of proof that rests on them. And when they adopt these nefarious things of calling people deniers, it's just a despicable way to run science. And they're always saying, well, the science says. Well, this is the opposite of science. Science is supposed to allow both people to speak, and they're trying to have a cancel culture for people that disagree with them on pretty much anything that is against socialism.
Yeah, well, we can go with one last question since you talked about cancel culture. So I would like to ask Professor Mendenhall what is his opinion about cancel culture on a number of topics.
Oh,
not particularly environmentalism.
Well, the problem with cancel culture is that it is fundamentally at odds with the free exchange of ideas, and that's the biggest problem with it. I mean, if you can't defeat an idea with an idea, and you have to resort to some form of institutionalized coercion, then, as Walter says, you discredit your own position. So you'd be more convincing in your case if you fought it out rhetorically and discursively, and let your ideas win out in the marketplace. Convince more people that you're right. I have a feeling that in the long run, you are doing your own cause a disservice by trying to drum people into submission. And so, I mean, it's a massive topic. There's a lot that could be said about cancel culture, but just in a sort of soundbite format, that's what I would say about it.
I would just say that I'm a big fan of John Stuart Mill on liberty. And when John Stuart Mill says, on liberty, if you don't understand the other side, you don't even understand your own side, because your own side is in tandem with the other side. And
Right.
If you cancel the other side, you cheat yourself. And we cheat our students if we don't acquaint them with both sides. And to cancel one side is to cancel the other side as well.
Yeah, back when I was in high school and middle school, all the English teachers would have you write an argument from the side you disagreed with, and that was all you did back then. I don't think that stuff gets done anymore. I could be wrong. I don't know what goes on in middle school classrooms, but it just doesn't seem like that's sort of the approach to take it. And that seemed transgressive and edgy back then, but and now it would be even more so because the orthodoxy is so different.
Well,
Hugo, thanks for having us, and thanks for inviting Alan. Alan's a new buddy of mine now.
Yeah, good to see you, Walter. We'll hang out next time you're in Auburn. I actually live in Auburn, so we'll have dinner.
Oh, wow, that'd be wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Hugo, if you're in town, you're invited as well.
You're invited too. That's right.
Maybe next year. Maybe when I come back to the Mises Institute. Thank you very much, guys. It's been a pleasure to have a talk with you, and see you soon in the program, and see you soon whenever there's a chance.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.